Prove God exists right now. It was a sentence that cut through the morning like a dropped plate. The teacher, 38 years old and known across the district for sharp lectures and an even sharper skepticism toward anything labeled miraculous, set a battered pocket watch on the teacher's desk and stared at a room full of 35 high school seniors. His name was Daniel Hart, Latin teacher and debate coach, 42 by most records, though he preferred to wear a look of controlled weariness that kept questions at bay. In the bright square of fluorescent light, the classroom smelled of dry chalk and spilled coffee. A 92-centimeter wall clock ticked a time he felt no need to respect. He spoke with the kind of clipped clarity that had won him debate trophies and the reluctant admiration of principals. This would be, he said, a test of rhetoric and of claims that had crept into public life without evidence. He did not expect the answer to be literal. He did not expect anyone to stand up and answer as if the line between sermon and science had been crossed with shoes on. He did not expect the smell of lemon hand soap from the back row to be the last ordinary thing in the room. What followed would change names on attendance sheets and the way a community measured credibility. What followed would no longer be merely about theories. If you had been there, would you have heard the clock differently in that pause between challenge and reply? What you are about to hear is a careful account of truth, memory, and the way ordinary people make room for the impossible. The interruption came slow, like a tide. The intruder was not someone most would call a demonstration artist or a proselytizer. He wore a simple cotton shirt that had seen many suns and a jacket with threadbare elbows. No badge, no microphone, no placard. He took a seat at the back by the window and folded his hands into a gesture that read as both humility and unhurried intention. He did not belong to the pattern of backpacks and earbuds. He was a figure who carried a presence rather than a story. The first thing noticed was his calm voice when he asked a single question that reframed the challenge not as a provocation but as an invitation. "Do you want to know what proof looks like to a heart that has already stopped?" he asked quietly. A murmur went through the room. A student named Luis Ortega nudged his neighbor Claire Newen and pointed at the man without believing he should. A teacher named Miss Parks, who taught chemistry down the hall, paused outside the classroom and listened. The challenge had been intended as a rhetorical stunt, and suddenly it had a witness who appeared to take it literally. The public nature of the test altered into a personal summons. That first exchange was 9 lines of speech if counted cleanly between Daniel and the stranger and the students who interjected. It set the room along a new axis. The camera of later reports would zoom on a water stain on the ceiling and a coffee ring near Daniel's textbook. The sensory details of that moment, the rustle of a paper sleeve, the distant thump of a janitor's cart, the metallic taste of tension were recorded by minds and by a phone lens someone was already raising without announcing it. A debate would become an enactment. Those in the room felt the air change in a way they would keep describing for months. Daniel had built his authority on evidence and on the grammar of doubt. His backstory was a ledger of reasons. Raised in a small industrial town, his father worked mornings at a plant and his mother balanced the books of a diner. Daniel learned to prize verification because early promises in his life had been broken without ceremony. In college, he read critically and taught himself to question not as a posture but as a survival skill. He had been 40 when he had lost his younger sister to an illness that did not respond to bedside prayers and hospital charts. That grief reshaped him into an educator who refused gap-filling and preferred measured conclusions to consolation. He taught Latin because the language offered structure and clarity. He collected artifacts of skeptical thought, quotes from philosophers inked into margins, and a shelf of books that had been written to test belief. He believed in the slow accumulation of evidence, and in peer review, and in the idea that extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof. For 20 years he had been comfortable exposing sloppy reasoning, and he wore his reputation like armor in faculty meetings. His students saw him as a compass that refused superstition. He could walk into meetings with Dr. Michael Hargrove, the school counselor, and walk out with the district award for curriculum development, and he still felt a hollow that public recognition could not fill. He had loved once and been rejected by a faith community when he voiced questions, and that exile had taught him that clarity sometimes meant loneliness. These facts were not dramatic in themselves, but they explained why a burning challenge would be both performance and protective act. He put a watch on the desk to mark time because time was what he trusted. The figure who would be called in later reports the visitor had his own small archive of signs. He introduced himself to no one with a title, and he offered no credentials, and yet he carried with him the kind of quiet that suggested a long acquaintance with waiting. His backstory was woven of brief sketches that travelers and neighbors would remember. He had been seen offering water to a man on a bus once and speaking softly to a nurse at an emergency room desk when others hurried past. He had worked with a community food bank under an assumed name and had left letters of thanks anonymous in church donation boxes. His accent was neither local nor foreign, and he spoke as if he had learned to use words only after listening. He told a few people, later, that he worked with the elderly in a small hospice 2 hours away, and that he read to a man who could not speak, but who smiled when someone read poetry. To neighbors he was simply Jacob, and he volunteered at the library where he repaired bindings. He owned one unadorned book with a cracked leather cover and a faded ribbon that he kept on his lap when he sat. He seemed to know the contours of sorrow. When asked about his education, he pointed to a road he had walked and to a set of small choices rather than to diplomas. His humility complicated a modern world that equated value with status and credential. That modest resonance would make him a difficult subject to pin down in a police report or in a newspaper profile. His story moved people, not because it fit a narrative, but because it matched wounds many had and named them simply. The class moved from a rhetorical salvo to a kind of courtroom. Voices rose and fell. The intruder offered a request more than a claim. "There is a student in a room down the hall whose name is Samuel," he said softly. "He had a fever last week and he cannot walk today. If you would test God, prove for 3 minutes, I will ask him to stand." The sentence hung between the tick of the wall clock and the rustle of an absent-minded page. The students were not actors. Some laughed nervously. Others looked toward the doorway as if expecting a production crew to appear. Daniel exhaled, and then, using tenor and teaching, he countered with precise skepticism. "Evidence requires objective documentation," he said. "I will not accept anecdotes as proof. Science requires replicable results." The stranger responded with stories of the hospice of a man named Elias who had refused visitors until someone read a line of scripture that made him cry. "Is testimony worthless?" he asked. A sequence of exchanges followed between Daniel, the stranger, Louis Clare, and 2 other students named Maya and Alex. There were 11 verbal turns in that scene, if counted by direct speech. The dialogue was full of interruptions, apologies, quick retorts, and the kind of humane hesitation that speaks louder than certainty. Sensory details accumulated. A student banged a pencil, and the sound seemed disproportionately loud. The chalk dust shimmered in a beam of light. The stranger's hands smelled faintly of soap and of earth. Daniel's voice at one point shook, and no one had thought him human enough to tremble. That instability made the auditorium of ordinary class into a place of risk. The proposition was simple and precise. 3 minutes for... The stakes were unspecified, but felt personal. As questions multiplied, the scene deepened into confession. The stranger spoke quietly about his mother, and a last morning when she said a line that he kept in a pocket like a pressed leaf. She said, "Forgiveness is a small door you open often," he told the room, and then he described a student named Samuel whose mother worked double shifts and who had been on a waiting list for physical therapy. The story landed with the weight of a stone at the bottom of a pool. Daniel's own childhood ghost rose. He felt an old ache in his chest, and his fingers found the rim of the pocket watch and turned it as if seeking a second hand he could follow. The confrontation stretched into a deeper argument about responsibility, about the ethics of promises, and about the cruelty of expecting certainty in matters that people lived through. This escalation included a tight set of paragraphs where emotion outpaced argument. The intruder asked a question that was not logical but intimate. "If you had been the one to pray and nothing changed, would you stop?" he asked the teacher. The teacher refused to answer at first, and then gave a line about not abandoning reason. A student asked whether faith could be a social support and not a metaphysical claim. Those back and forths built tension deliberately. The room smelled now of ozone from the old fluorescent lights and of the citrus from a cleaner someone had used that morning. Claire's knuckles were white on her notebook corner. Louis kept glancing at his phone even though he had nothing to post. The sensory field of the debate included the late autumn light stretching across desks and the slight damp on the teacher's sleeve from a spilled coffee cup unnoticed until now. Arguments in that scene amounted to a small war where no one had signed up for casualty reports. The intimate revelation followed. The intruder turned a single question into a mirror aimed at Daniel. He described a bench in a park and the precise thud of a dog collar as a boy ran past. He named a childhood loss that fit too closely with details Daniel had never spoken aloud but had published in public obituaries and discussion boards. The room felt suddenly narrow. Daniel's voice rationalized, then failed. He stepped back from the desk and his legs almost buckled. The teacher, who had spent decades dismantling belief systems, experienced a collapse of professional composure. He began to cry, not in a theatrical way, but with a raw sound that stripped the air of the room. Students who had sat in rows saw authority fall away, and the fall revealed a human being. One moment recorded on a student camera later showed the watch trembling on the desk and Daniel's hand hovering over it as if letting the instrument measure the descent. There were 3 moments in the sequence that count as maximum tension, in which silence became an active presence. In the first, the stranger took a breath and said the name of Daniel's sister, and the room felt the exhale as a physical movement. In the second, Daniel tried to speak, and only a wet sound came. In the third, sheriff-like logic, in the form of a school administrator, followed by angry parents, pushed against a kernel of grief that refused to obey rules. Each of these 3 moments filled 2 paragraphs of recollection later, and each was heavy enough that witnesses would later describe them with the same cadence of disbelief. Emotion had become the hinge on which the rest of the day turned. And then something happened that people with trained eyes and hearts would later call inexplicable. The person named Samuel, who the stranger had mentioned earlier, had been in the small clinic 2 doors down and was wheeled in by Nurse Anna Patel and by Dr. Michael Hargrove, who had been there to consult. He was pale and his calf muscles trembled. He could not stand without help when he was brought into the classroom hall where chairs had been moved to make space. The fluorescent lights bounced off a linoleum floor, and the air carried a scent of antiseptic and of the warm breath of anxious family members. The stranger told Samuel his name and placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, and then he asked a question to those present that no one expected. "Do you want to try?" he said. The boy blinked, and then, with a sound like a small breaking, he pushed himself to his feet. The action was not instant, and it was not cinematic in a tidy way. His legs wobbled, his mother gasped, his eyes were glassy with tears of pain and effort. At first, the skeptical response came from Daniel and from Dean Robert Ellis, who arrived minutes later, and from Dr. Hargrove, who checked Samuel's reflexes and his pulse. There was a chorus of methodological insistence. Someone recorded the event on a phone, and later forensic analysis would show frames where muscle contraction could be mapped. Witnesses described the sensation in the room as if a pressure had been released. The intruder spoke softly to Samuel, and the boy walked across a small span of floor with assistance, then took a second step, then, after a pause, a third. Those in the room measured the steps and measured their own disbelief.
There were 5 to 6 sensory notes in that scene. The cold of the linoleum, the metallic tang of worry, the dampness of a mother's palm on Samuel's shoulder, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the faint smell of hand lotion on the intruder's fingers as he touched the boy. Testimony followed. Students wrote down what they saw. Ms. Park swore she felt heat on her face, as if the room had moved toward light. Lewis recorded audio, and the waveform
later showed a low frequency change at the moment Samuel first bore weight on his feet. The immediate effect was a mix of jubilation and rigorous skepticism. Investigations began within hours. The school called a meeting with Dr. Hargrove, the district health officer, and with a clinical team from a local hospital. Protocols were followed. Samuel's medical records were photocopied and sealed. Blood tests were drawn showing normal inflammatory markers, and imaging was scheduled. Neurological assessments measured gait and reflexes in defined protocols, and a physical therapy plan was documented. The technical details of the medical review included a description of electromyography to measure muscle response and a basic outline of imaging sequences such as MRI T2 weighted scans to identify changes in soft tissue which returned unremarkable findings. The procedural summary was precise and measured to show that the team did not skip steps. The investigators also interviewed witnesses and logged statements in a chain of custody to make sure recordings were untampered. A police report noted nothing criminal. The medical description detailed the standard battery of tests a hospital performs to document an unexpected recovery, and it filled about 300 characters with concrete language about electrodes, placement, timing, and data archiving to satisfy a scientific appetite for traceable evidence. In short, the immediate post-event period became a hybrid of celebration and documentation. The local press converged. Claire Newen, who had filmed the earliest moments, uploaded a raw clip that circulated, and before long, reporters from the city sat in the back of the room. A reporter named Claire asked questions with a notebook and a voice that balanced curiosity with incredulity. A cameraman called Tomas Alvarez tried to capture the precise faces without theatrics. Social media erupted with claims and counterclaims, and the school placed a temporary embargo on interviews so as not to disrupt privacy protocols. The tension between the requirement for evidence and the flood of testimony defined the next 48 hours. The community response rippled outward. Pastor Samuel Reed from the local church organized a prayer circle outside the school gate and brought people together who had not met before. Principal Mariah Thompson requested a careful statement for the newspapers and scheduled a town hall. Parents like Elena Garcia and Robert Cho demanded answers. An investigative journalist named Claire Newen published an initial piece that quoted both skeptical professionals and those who felt a wider meaning. The framing varied by outlet. The scientific press demanded replicable evidence. The religious community prayed and testified. The story was now larger than a classroom, and Daniel found himself in the eye of a storm that had public wind. He was asked to give a statement on camera, and he declined. He felt pressure from colleagues like Dr. Michael Hargrove, who urged caution, and from students who wanted the truth. He began a private process of reflection, and the diary he kept at night showed long entries of doubt and of a slow softening that began with small act, a longer pause, before a correction, a note in a margin that read, "Forgive," in a shaky hand. He was interviewed off the record by Professor Helen Carter from the university, who wanted to analyze the sociological dynamics. The media attention had practical consequences. A team from the hospital seeking more tests, a legal firm advising the district, and a rising rumor about the visitor's identity. Names were circulated, and then retracted. The balancing act of institutional responsibility and human curiosity strained the normal mechanisms of school governance. The deeper transformation unfolded as personal consequences stacked into a pattern. In private, Daniel sat on the bench by the old elm behind the school and unfolded memories that had been folded sharp and tight. He thought of his sister, and of the morning after the funeral when he had thrown his pocket watch into a drawer and never wound it again. He replayed the intruder's soft insistence and the look in Samuel's eyes as he stepped. He started attending small meetings where parents and teachers discussed grief and resilience. He refused at first to join a prayer circle, yet he went to listen. He met with Pastor Samuel Reed to talk about the social dimensions of community support, and he later apologized for the way he had spoken about faith in front of students. His confession was quiet, a concession not to doctrine but to the limits of human certainty. The visitor, whose name some thought was Jacob, did not seek fame. He made a few visits to the clinic and sat in the waiting room reading aloud to elderly volunteers. He did not give interviews. He left after a week with a small note for Samuel and for Daniel that said, "Forgive and remember." The practical changes were tangible. The school reallocated funds to support physical therapy programs. Luis, who had filmed the first sequence, began a peer support group for students caring for family members. Teacher Maya, who had argued hardest against supernatural explanations, started a reading group pairing medical literature with memoirs about recovery. Names mattered. The ripple created projects. The university, that once sent Professor Helen Carter to observe, created a seminar on public testimony and the ethics of evidence. 3 moments of acute tension returned later in other contexts, and each had to be detailed. The first was a faculty hearing requested by a group of parents who accused Daniel of staging events for attention. The room was formal and smelled of polished wood and coffee. Daniel defended himself and his methods, while emotion rose and the testimony of Samuel's mother quieted the room. This standoff forced the district to produce records and to face the human cost of spectacle. The second moment came when a professor at the university leaked an analysis that suggested a possible psychosomatic explanation, and certain members of the community felt betrayed. Students wore stickers, and the town divided into camps that used words like skepticism and faith. The third took place during a conversations. The third took place during a documentary film shoot where invasive questions about the visitor's past caused an elderly neighbor to break down in tears. Each of these moments required careful mediation, and each was painful enough to be described at length because they showed the collision between institutional inquiry and individual dignity. The epilogue must be told in time increments, because time is where meaning often gathers in unexpected ways. 1 month later, the school had a new plan. The physical therapy schedule for Samuel included 3 sessions a week, and he showed continued improvement measured by range of motion tests and by a standardized gait assessment. Daniel had written a short piece for the school newsletter that did not mention miracles or theology, but that spoke of bearing witness and humility. He had met with Dr. Michael Hargrove, and they agreed to develop a protocol that balanced rapid response with compassion when the unexpected occurred. Luis had started a peer support group that met in the library on Tuesdays, and Maya volunteered to oversee it. The visitor had left a small envelope with a pressed leaf and a single line that read, "Remember forgiveness." The community felt a cautious sense of repair, and the town paper published an editorial urging calm inquiry and compassion. 3 months later, more formal evaluations were complete. Samuel completed a 6-week outpatient rehabilitation program, and his progress was documented in physical therapy notes that showed improved muscle strength and balance metrics. The district contracted with the university lab to do a review of the audio and video footage, and the report concluded that while there were anomalies in timing and in some waveform signatures, the data did not provide an explanation for causation. The press had moved on, in part, and yet people still gathered in conversation circles, now organized to talk about grief, resilience, and the ethics of witness. Daniel enrolled in a course on narrative medicine, not because he had become religious, but because he wanted to understand stories patients told and how they shaped outcomes. Principal Mariah Thompson implemented new guidelines for in-school incidents to protect privacy and to preserve the dignity of families. Pastor Samuel Reed led community workshops of listening and practical support, and the local clinic increased sliding-scale therapy slots. The visitor returned to leave a note in the library book with lines from a poem that later became a common quote in the support group. 6 months later, the legacy had become concrete. Samuel was participating in school life. He had joined a club, and his laughter could be heard in hallways where silence had once been the rule. Daniel had written an essay that was published in a regional journal about the intersection of doubt and care, and he accepted a speaking invitation to discuss the ethics of teaching. The school had established a paid position for a student well-being coordinator funded by a community partnership. Included donations from local businesses and support from the university. Lewis became an advocate for caregiving students presenting at a small conference. And Claire, who had filmed the initial event, went on to pursue investigative journalism. The visitor's presence remained a gentle and enigmatic part of the story. He was remembered not as a celebrity, but as a neighbor who carried water, and who sat with people who hurt. The town adopted a new public health measure linking schools to community clinics for quicker support. The most important legacy, however, was private. Daniel, who had been a skilled skeptic, learned to live with an openness that allowed grief and evidence to coexist without collapsing into either cynicism or credulity. He started to visit the hospice on Saturdays, to read quietly to those who were alone, and in those rooms, he learned how small gestures gather into the architecture of meaning. If you came away wondering about the nature of proof, the story resists easy categorization. There was no single experiment replicated in multiple laboratories. There were recorded steps and medical notes and witnesses who described the same movement of a young boy against a backdrop of skepticism and institutional checks. There were long debates and difficult public conversations. More than anything, there were people who had been changed in practical, compassionate ways. The discourse that followed used words like credibility, revelation, miracle, and testimony, and the community kept arguing about the balance between evidence and experience. The teacher who had challenged a claim about God found that his life had been altered less by a demonstration and more by the unfolding responsibilities it revealed. He had to revise not only how he spoke in class, but how he listened to those who carried suffering. The visitor, who some would later call Jacob, vanished as quietly as he had come, leaving behind a note, a press leaf, and a string of small projects that supported the vulnerable. Names mattered. People like Nurse Anna Patel, Dr. Michael Hargrove, Dean Robert Ellis, Principal Mariah Thompson, Pastor Samuel Reed, Luis Ortega, Claire Noyen, Maya Alex, and Elena Garcia all intersected, and their actions created a network of care. Their testimonies were varied, but they shared one claim that had nothing to do with miracles and everything to do with human response. Namely, that when a life changed, it called for a practical response, and that response had the power to become part of a legacy. What should you make of it? All I can do is report the sequence of people, actions, and documents, and leave the philosophical verdict to you. Some will read a miracle into the event, and others will call it an anomaly that insists on further analysis. The most important point may be this: the line between faith and reason is not always a cliff. It can be a bridge built by small acts like arranging therapy, organizing a support group, offering time and presence. If this story touched you, I remember, or if I were there, and tell us briefly what you felt. Your words help others feel less alone and help shape what comes next. If you want more carefully researched stories about moments where reason and the human heart meet, subscribe and join a community that tries to hold both questions and care with respect. At the end of the day, the classroom where a teacher once challenged God became a classroom where people learned a different lesson about humility and duty. Daniel did not convert to any tidy doctrine, and the town did not produce unanimous agreement. Instead, something more mundane and more profound occurred: a reshaping of priorities, a new set of supports, a willingness to keep both inquiry and compassion in view. The hardest proofs are not always found in labs. Sometimes they are found in the patient accumulation of small acts that alter how a community treats its vulnerable. If you watched closely, you would have noticed not only a wound exposed, but a set of hands offering care. That is the legacy of this episode, and that is what lingered in the months and years after. If this account moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that. Sometimes the impossible shows up, not to settle arguments, but to call people to take care.